should wait for anyone else, or do you think I should just run?
My friend hopefully will be here in a couple of minutes. We had mentioned since he originally quite thoughtful that he was on the tube. It would spoil if we made a start with
If we made a start.
Anyway. Have you heard nothing from your...
The other two, no.
Okay.
I mean, it could be the weather, it could be anything, but anyway. So this is our Liberty series, the first edition, focusing on Rousseau from our University of Buckingham's Political Thought Reading Club. I'm Samuel Woodall presenting this talk, and I'm doing intellectual history as a PhD at Buckingham. We'll commence just with a little bit of an overview on Rousseau and the social contract. So Rousseau was a Swiss-French philosopher, writer, composer, wrote the opera Le Devin de Village, which is any of it. Yeah. He came up with his own scoring system and everything, which I think you had heard of. We discussed it once, I think, but he came up with his own form of notation, a real sort of polymath. He is considered one of the most influential figures in Western political thought, and particularly in the fields of both political theory and education. So his seminal work, The Social Contract, is what we're going to be looking at today. Oh, that could be someone now. Hang on. Fantastic. Well, it's wonderful to have increased the number.
Would you like a drink? Oh, lovely, yes. We've got wine, Coke, flavoured water. Where do we have that one? That's right. We just started.
Well, as I was saying, the seminal work of Rousseau's is in 1762, The Social Contract. He introduced the idea of legitimate government, which must be based on the consent of the governed, a concept that would shape modern democratic theory. Rousseau's critique of contemporary society also advanced the notion that humans are inherently good, but that societal structures corrupt the natural goodness, which may be a little bit reminiscent of some, Christian theology, perhaps. A revolutionary stance that challenged the prevailing belief in the inherent selfishness of humans. His ideas about human nature, freedom, society, they all continue to inspire and provoke debates, particularly within feminist and post-colonial studies, the feminists being rather anti-Rousseau in contemporary circles. So just to quickly run through the other texts that are sort of supplementary to what we've been looking at, you've got his initial work. So he submitted the Discourse on the Arts and Sciences as an essay competition at Dijon University. And Rousseau's intellectual contributions are recognised in various ways. Isaiah Berlin highlighted the concept of the noble savage as a key inspiration for Romanticism, which is why some writers refer to Rousseau as a proto-romantic, whilst Jonathan Israel positioned him as a precursor to the Enlightenment, so actually sitting outside of the proper Enlightenment, emphasising individual freedom and equality. Skinner, on the other hand, explored Rousseau's impact on the development of modern democracy, particularly through his conception of popular sovereignty and the social contract. Rousseau's critiques of modernity were groundbreaking, and in a Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, he attacked the moral decay he saw in contemporary society, particularly the pursuit of status and wealth. He argued that true virtue cannot be learned through study, but must come from an authentic personal commitment to moral living. Rousseau also critiqued the commercialisation of society, lamenting the loss of shared compassion in the face of early capitalism's focus on materialism. Again, this is a feature that is being investigated quite a lot at the moment within Enlightenment Studies. Professor Richard Watmore at the University of St Andrews has just last year released a book called The End of Enlightenment, which is all about how commercialisation of society killed off Enlightenment, that it kind of took the values from the Enlightenment to push forward commercial and kind of more vain interests. You've also got the Discourse on Inequality, where Rousseau examined the rise of inequality, its destructive effects on freedom. He idealised a simple pre-social state of nature in which humans were free from the corruption of societal conventions. Rousseau's belief in the fundamental goodness of humanity, seen in his reflections on the natural world, contrasted sharply with the selfishness and vanity he attributed to modern civilization. He believed that to overcome the ills of society, humans must return to the values of simplicity and mutual care. Rousseau's unique synthesis of reason and passion, particularly in his reflections on ethics, further complicated the Enlightenment's focus on rationality. He posited that ethical decisions are shaped by both our desires and our reason, and that compassion for others is a natural and essential part of human nature, which then puts him into the categorisation for some historians of counter-Enlightenment. Rousseau's legacy has been profound and enduring, shaping the intellectual landscapes of political theory, education and moral philosophy, and continues to resonate across contemporary debates on equality, freedom and justice. So this is the book of the social contract that we're looking at this week. The discussion will focus on book 4 of Rousseau's social contract. In this section, Rousseau delves into the complexities of the general will, the role of the sovereign, and the delicate balance between individual freedom and collective authority within the state. We'll explore Rousseau's arguments on the necessity of civil religion, the challenges posed by faction, and his provocative assertion that individuals may need to be forced to be free. Our discussion will also consider Rousseau's thoughts on education, democracy, and the potential tensions between the majority's will and the rights of the minority. And yeah, so that's my introduction done. And now we can start. I've got some prompt questions there, which are a little bit small, but yeah, well, I'll perch myself down, and maybe Jack, you might want to kick us off with a pointer, or
I wonder if a good place to begin was in anthropology. The particular vision he puts forward of the fundamental goodness of man, the idea that comes in halfway through the excerpt where he says man is born free. The famous line is follows and every way is in chains, but that's not what he actually writes there, so I don't know where that one comes from. But he says man is born free and master of himself, and that the social contract represents the most voluntary act, and he finds it desirable that such an act would be the foundation of a civil society. And then you also have this idea that the general will is self-evident to simple men. I find every one of those propositions problematic, and so I wonder if that, or at least certainly wanting clarification for my mind, and so maybe that would be a good place to start. Okay. Why is the general will self-evident?
What does he mean by the general will?
He seems to mean, as far as I could tell, whatever would be in the best interest of the... It's a synonym of the common good. So you get phrases like that we use so often now, like the general well-being. And he said that in the very beginning that the general will pertain to a corpse, a political corpse, though not all political corps will have one will. So it seems to have something to do with perpetuating the best possible version of the corpse through time.
I mean, you could see it as simply like a grounding of our sort of majoritarian systems where whoever has the largest say that overrules any other minority say is heading in the correct direction. I think that I don't personally think, and we were sort of discussing this the other night, I don't personally think that was necessarily what he was driving at in terms of just excluding any other voice, because of some contextual factors that we can raise in the discussion. But yeah, I think one of the readings would simply be that it's kind of like the majority, the majority.
But he's not a Democrat.
He's certainly not a Democrat, no.
So he's kind of, there's this kind of belief that he somehow can touch what the general will of the population. That's why there's a sort of resurgence of connection between Rousseau and Trump. The idea that somehow the MAGA movement represents America, and that's the general will. But there's no there's no fundamental basis for that, and therefore it's not democratic in the true sense of the word, I think.
No. What would you say, Jack?
Yes, Rousseau seems hostile to a certain kind of democracy because he's very anxious about debate. He's very anxious about conflicting opinions. He he has this idea that the longer these debates go on, this is going to be indicative of a decay, that there are ulterior motives, because he believes that this is self-evident, and so of course we know that debate can be a weapon to stifle democracy and to stifle public interest. However, I also think debate is quite essential to figuring out the complexities of the world. Now, I appreciate that there will be some contextual factors here, because I'm very ignorant of history, so I'm glad you were both here, and yourself, Peter, assuming you probably know more about the historical context than I do as a main philosopher. But you explained to me, Sam, that he's in a much smaller society, a much smaller government.
Or at least his idealised form of government is Geneva. It is the Canton of Geneva that has a direct democratic system, rather than a large mammoth state like France, which, when it needs to hold the Estates General, etc., to try and push these decisions through, he sees that as just such a leviathan state that it's just not functional. So for him, he's looking to Geneva, his homeland, and thinking, well, a small state like that seems to be able to function okay, because people can actually interact with one another in the body politic on a very personal basis and come to those conclusions together, rather than needing to rely on a large assembly to be able to deliberate and take a long time to be able to get to those conclusions. So there is that there. But I think going back to your original point, how does a general will become self-evident? I mean, it's a very sort of Enlightenment notion that if you rationalise far enough, everyone, of course, will come to the same conclusion.
Right, but it's slightly different in Rousseau, because it's not rationally self-evident, it's morally self-evident, I think. So it's self-evident to simple men of good conscience who do not have competing motives, so they're well-tempered.
And I think that's why the Swiss Canton of Geneva sort of idea, it was a much more religiously moral society than the corrupt French. And so, to some extent, I think that's partly why Rousseau had momentum with the revolution, because he kind of was seen as the moral centre.
Striving for that, that moral, and commentators in Britain in the 1740s are referring to, because of the after the Glorious Revolution, commentators in Britain are referring to the virtuous clergy of Geneva, that is what a real Protestant country would strive after. So certainly, I think in that 1750s, 1760s, that is still the sentiment that somewhere like Geneva is the epitome of a kind of moral society. But I still don't know necessarily how it would become self-evident to an individual. And I think there are two options. There is either the sort of the kind of moral characteristic idea, but then there is the darker side, which is that if you don't come to that conclusion, you're excluded from what is the body politic, and that's where a lot of sort of historians in the sort of 1950s, after the Second World War, and looking to these dictatorial regimes in the 20th century, were saying, well, you can see this in Rousseau, you can see that his idea of the general will it's compelling, and we'll come to that, where he says you will know to compel people to be free, essentially. But I mean, even just on a practical basis, day to day, I think you could also say, well, is he not just talking about the idea of reaching some sense of consensus, some sort of ultimate consensus, which probably wouldn't seem too drastic to us. It's only when we read into it that it's kind of this more exclusionary approach to political philosophy. Because also you could, surely, I don't know about yourself, but when you hear the term general will, I wouldn't automatically think that it feels kind of too forceful. I think it could come across as quite kind of normal in our politics today that we want to reach some kind of general will.
Yeah, the trouble is that the use of general will has got sort of Nazi overtones. Because that was the idea of Hitler's. He represented the will of the people. And But I think you can't necessarily, I mean, this is where the intellectual history is, you can't just post interpret because something happens afterwards that somehow, and I think you need to go back to his point in time, because it's dangerous just sort of like interpreting him and saying, well, he's like Hitler or like Trump, but he wasn't, because he was of that era. He was, because I think there was a big debate with him and Voltaire. They didn't, well, neither liked each other.
No.
And I think part of what Rousseau was also doing was challenging the apparent corruption of the idea that people would get on by competing and over, trying to outwit everybody. And whereas he, coming back to the kind of Geneva Canton, the idea that there was a society that was somehow
virtuous,
working together for the whole.
Exactly.
And he was kind of very much against that sort of corrupt commercialism, I think.
Exactly, and about the rise of faction in a commercial society. And as I was saying in the discussion of the book that came before the social contract, which is the Discourse on Inequality, that is also his argument about his sort of genealogy of man, essentially, that in a pre-social state we weren't competitive, we were either isolated and just satisfying ourselves, or if we saw another in need at some point, he's got this very sort of romantic view of the pre-social man, which is that without those kind of elements of corruption, you would just be supporting one another, essentially. So that is ultimately his ideal society, and that's what he thinks Geneva is at least closest to. In terms of the sort of discourse, you have got a lot of similar phrases being used at the time, because you've also got Thomas Paine writing Common Sense, and again, Common Sense is a very similar sort of concept, but going off in a different tangent in terms of the idea that, again, if we strive hard enough, we can reach this kind of ultimate state of understanding, of rationalising. But the difference with Rousseau, as you've raised, is that it's much more of a moral characteristic, I think, rather than just the rational.
Yeah, and in my view, when it comes to politics, there should be some sort of synthesis of both, because you can have all the good intentions in the world, but unless you're informed about all the factors going on in your state, and not only in your state, but also beyond it, all the external relations your state has, you can't actually render effective judgments. So I think that's part of where I would say that's why the general will is not self-evident, but there has to be quite painstaking research done into the lives of people within and without your jurisdiction.
I suppose it also depends on how specific his idea of the general will is. That if you have, I think you can make a pretty plausible case that when you abstract enough from ordinary life, people generally have a very similar view of how society ought to work and what things should happen and so on. And when you don't talk about specific quantities of taxes or things like that, you just say, well, I think public transport should run on time, and I think people should live together in harmony. And so you can get to a certain level where everybody has the same ideas. But the problem is, I'm not sure, is that all he's claiming? Because if so, I don't think that's a very controversial thing. If he's saying that everybody actually really has the same ideas about how many taxes everyone should be paying at what stage of income or whatever it might be, it's just that we haven't really realised it yet, or some people's intellects are clouded. That seems to be quite a naive thing to say.
I don't know whether it has a connection, but I think the link to the idea of education is the idea that a child was not a blank state or somehow impure. There was a purity of childhood that could be brought out, and that was essentially stifled by the corrupt society. So to some extent there was a sort of inherent goodness, and therefore that collectively was the will, I think. And it was the fact that people weren't educated in the right way, and therefore we got to a state where the society was somehow going wrong, like France, and needed to change. And I think that's partly why he was sort of taken up. I thought he was supported by sort of more purist in the revolution. I think.
I know Robespierre.
Robespierre.
Oh, very much so. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I hear that all the great revolutionaries read him, including like Lenin and
Yeah. Yeah.
probably the people responsible for the 1848 revolution.
Well, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
When I read that, concerned me.
I think there's also what is quite enlightenment about him rather than counter-enlightenment is also that there is a very sort of logical end to this idea of the general will as well, which is it almost is a little bit Platonic in the kind of the sort of psyche-state binary where the psyche is supposed to match the kind of composition of the state, and he is essentially saying, he writes about how can the opponents be both free and placed in subjection to laws that they haven't consented. Like you can't have a free and good society if there's someone who disagrees, and it's almost like a kind of just a logical conundrum for him, which is like, well, if they're not agreeing and they're not, then they're being compelled, which means they're not free, which means that they have to be excluded because otherwise the state can't be free itself because there's someone there who's disagreeing with what everyone else is wanting to advocate to be free. So there is quite a kind of logical element to the political.
The freedom is predicated on the unity of the political cause.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, right, wow.
Almost because he's saying, because otherwise a minority wouldn't feel free. So this is where the counter-argument to the kind of line towards a Hitler or a Stalin can come, which is that, well, he's not saying that they should be oppressed or forced. He's just sort of saying, well, and this, I suppose, going back to your point, Peter, in terms of education, does come to his final book, which I didn't mention because it's after the social contract, but Emile, and the idea of re-educating society, that ultimately if there are elements that think that they're not part of the general will, then ultimately what needs to happen, again this sounds very Stalinist, but a re-education of society going forward to enable them to think freely and then a kind of more contented general will. But I think fundamentally, at least from an intellectual history perspective, in terms of the context, there is this thing about states are just too big at the moment, and you can't have a general will in a massive state, and that's where we kind of need to read it as he is very much looking at Geneva.
Yeah.
I find the context of Geneva very interesting, though, what he's writing, because on one hand you can say Geneva embodies his perfect state, and there's not that much corruption, it's fairly small, there's sort of a lot of harmony. Generally speaking, things seem to go pretty well. On the other hand, the whole of his political philosophy is predicated on this idea that humanity in its state of nature is fundamentally good, and if just left to their own devices, if not educated, if not corrupted by society, human beings would flourish. And yet, the whole system of government of the state of Geneva is predicated on Calvinism, which includes in itself the idea that humanity is inherently corrupted and damned. It has to be saved kind of not because of any element of good in its own existence, but as a purely external thing. And I wonder whether that's an example of, there's this famous bit in Herodotus, which is now kind of very common. It's one of the things that people quote, whatever it is, like tough men create good times, good times create weak men create bad times create tough men, that kind of thing. That if you start from an assumption that actually human beings are inherently pretty flawed and we have to design society in a way that includes safeguards against this, you end up with a pretty harmonious society such that anyone growing up in that society could have an idea that human beings actually are inherently very good because look, everybody treats each other well, and then that consequently has the effect that society then disintegrates. I wonder if you could make that claim as well.
That's is it anapsychosis or the sort of Polybius's kind of thing about a bit like with the tyrannical government will then result in a democracy, and then the democracy will fall into oligarchy and go back to tyranny. Sort of thing.
Exactly.
But I was going to say on that point, and it's gone now, so someone might want to feel what I'm going to say. Also that bit, the context of his life is also very interesting because obviously his father is kicked out of Geneva, and he's kind of got this constant ode to Geneva to almost accept him again. But then when this is published, they're throwing it on the pyre. they're burning his book because they think that he's they think he's essentially saying, well, no society's good enough. Even though he's wanting to do it as an ode to Geneva, to say, oh, look, please accept me back, sort of thing. And they think, oh, no, he's far too kind of infused by this idea of, the general will and creating this kind of extremely harmonious society, and actually they think, oh wait, he's suggesting that no society's like this at the moment, so away it goes onto the burning pile. So I mean that's quite interesting as well. But
that conflict is that sort of inherent conflict in his thinking and what he did was also represented in the way that Voltaire criticised his treatment of his own children.
yes, yeah,
Who he had 5 children with a fairly ordinary woman who was sort of socially inferior, I think, but they were put in some kind of boarding school home, and so he wrote about what was good about education,
Yes,
and
yeah.
in fact, had no connection whatever with his own children.
yeah, and to try and vindicate himself would say in letters that, I just didn't think that I would be the good enough father that I've written about.
Yeah.
I won't live up to the own standards of what I've written for a good education. But yes, so should we turn to we've sort of covered the first question I read with one of Jack's, the idea of sovereignty, that it can't be represented or delegated in Book 4.
Yes.
What would you say, Jack? Sorry.
This is probably where I'm at my weakness, because my political philosophy is quite poor. But he was very careful. I quite admired, but this might be my ignorance of the political philosophers. Maybe others did it better. He was very careful to put balances on everything. Even at the point of he obviously recognises that there's a place the state goes where you have to, as it were, appoint for for a brief moment someone above the sovereign.
Yeah.
I guess it might be similar to what's going on in France at the moment when you get the places where it's all just gone to stagnation, and so we keep going through people and it's not going on. So do we end up choosing someone who can sort of come in by force and fix it?
Yeah.
But make sure it doesn't go on for too long. And you know the case study of Rome for this.
Since not just.
Yes. I don't know, because I don't know much about Roman history, how faithful he is to the events. He cites Romans and Spartans extensively. He's obviously very aware that there's something in the sovereign which ultimately is ineffective for liberty. You know, the final analysis of liberty, what liberty is and how it's going to be enabled, can't rest on a sovereign, even if the sovereign is elected. I never understood, if the sovereign in this, for Rousseau, is he an elected figure or is he like a prince or a king? He refers to the prince as well.
Yeah, and talks quite a lot about it in the
so this is
section as well.
So this is like a dynastic feature of the state. So it's not an elected feature.
Not really, no.
So So in that case, it's comparable then to the English situation post Cromwell, and thinking about the Glorious Revolution, that the sovereign himself is in a sense bound to a law.
Yeah.
And there is an independent body that can make sure that is enacted. Yeah. Even in the face of a sovereign who's unwilling to do that himself. So it's an interesting idea. Obviously very modern.
But I think that was one of the persistent challenges in that coming out of England, and then the original idea was that God vested his time on earth through the sovereign.
Yes.
And it seemed to me that part of the Protestant religion was sort of changing the idea that people could talk to God without necessarily the intervention of a priest, or the sovereign was important, but he was there. It wasn't like a big pyramid with the people at the bottom. And so I just wondered whether, again, you mentioned about Sparta, but I thought Sparta was a model for him. I don't know enough about Sparta. What that
No,
was,
I
'cause
think
that
you
was
would.
kind of the
I think
equivalent of
you would
Geneva.
only, I think, Sparta to criticise it from memory. The Spartan model was quite complicated. They had two royal families, basically, and they had representatives in a parliament. And then overseeing all that, they had 5 ephors, who I think were elected once every 2 years. And the ephor's role was to ensure that the state was fundamentally conservative. And the motive to make sure that was the case was that the next series of 5 ephors did a review of the prior series and would execute them if the state hadn't been sufficiently conservative. He had a few things to say about the ephors in the chapter. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't remember what and whether it was, but I got the impression he was only citing the Spartans to be critical. He was talking about what led to their demise.
Okay.
That there was something in this system which contained the seeds of its own destruction, probably a maladaptivity, but there were other things. That Rome is a much better case study because he doesn't go into way more detail with Rome. We should stay there.
Of which you Alex probably know is Alex.
Yeah. I mean, the Roman system was quite idealistic, I think, and ended up failing with the establishment of the empire. The Roman Republic was very much this idea that, not too dissimilar from Rousseau, which is why I think it influenced lots of Enlightenment figures and the founding fathers and so on, but that if you have a perfectly balanced, harmonious society where the aristocracy and the plebeians have just about enough things, yes, please, have just about enough kind of power, and they're not like the aristocrats are slightly more powerful than the plebeians, but actually there are checks and balances on everyone. Thanks.
Water, Peter,
Just some water. That'll be fine. Thank you.
So, I mean, essentially the way that worked was you had the Senate, which was pretty much a parliament, which was semi-elected, but the election process was kind of very convoluted. And then from the Senate, every year you'd elect 2 consuls. Well, was it every year? I think it was every 3 years or something. But anyway, every so often you'd elect 2 consuls who would be the 2 prime ministers, and they would keep each other in balance to make sure that one didn't overstep his authority, and they'd sort of take precedence at different points and whatever. And anyway, so that was also an election, but again quite a convoluted one. Every Roman citizen had the right to vote, but then they'd vote according to their tribe, and some tribes had many more votes than others. In a sense, almost like the American kind of state system, like the presidency. But they had also this very interesting idea of talking about going above the sovereign. They had this very interesting idea of the dictator, which is where we get the word dictator from, who could be elected by the Senate in time of need by some percentage of the Senate. I think it was something like 2/3. To basically take absolute power for a period of 3 years or 5 years, and the idea was that if anything like this needed doing, the dictator would take the power and then would exercise his power and then would just go back and get on with his life. And the famous example of this was this general Cincinnatus, who, semi-mythological, we don't really know much about him, but pretty much did this. He was a Roman general who retired, went off to his farm in southern Italy, time of great disaster and war. He was called in, became dictator for 3 years, then went back to his power. The problem is that after Cincinnatus, about 200 BC, pretty much every other dictator didn't behave like that. No. So you end up with a string of very kind of bloody dictators like Sulla and so on, until you get to Caesar, who then is the kind of ultimate example of this. And finally, at the death of Caesar, you get this whole civil war of all these factions falling out, and then you get the establishment of the empire under Augustus, where basically you have a de facto, although they keep the institutions of the state, you have a de facto autocratic government. So although Rome is very much beloved by Enlightenment thinkers as this sort of great example of checks and balances, I actually don't think it's a very good way for showing this works, because it clearly didn't.
But I think he's quite wary of that. I'm only making a very quick interjection. But I think his point is, and this comes back to the obsession about massive states, that he thinks that unchecked, the ideas, as much as he's a counter-Enlightenment figure in many ways, the great ideas that are coming from Enlightenment these visions of a republic and it could be the Roman Republic. He sort of discusses the kind of English republicanism and what was it again? That it's the fear that this kind of idea of, yes, dictator, but also just expansionism will snuff out that kind of republican, or also what's often tied in with republicanism is also, again, the idea of virtue and the idea of, the virtuous society. That was just going to be my point very quickly.
Yeah.
There is a wariness, so even if he's using it as an example, there is a wariness of the context, I think, for him, in terms of that could happen, exactly what you just described could happen.
Yes. But ultimately, he does say in principle that in his state, at least in his system, it would be it would be so constituted that by their own nature, people would not want to hold on to the dictatorial powers any longer than was necessary. He's on about 6 months, I think.
And that's because I did put about safeguards, and that's exactly that in terms of that element.
But the safeguards are primarily internal. The idea is that these people have kind of educated and formed so well that they will want to do this naturally.
Yes.
Which is quite an optimistic view of human nature.
well, he had all the way down. He had a very optimistic, I think, naively optimistic view of human nature. But one of the things I would put to Rousseau is I don't understand precisely where it is the vices actually originate from. If man is fundamentally good, you say, well, it comes into being with a sufficiently complex society, but where exactly is the level there? Because there is a primitive society in which everything's fine. What is the addition which tilts things over the edge? And if that is a potential, surely that indicates that the potential is nascent in man, and that would lead us to make an alternative judgment than that he's fundamentally good.
I thought he sort of saw commercial world as something that introduces the idea that you want in some way to be better than somebody else. So the sort of the kind of modern world, as he saw it, was somehow a corrupting idea that you would sort of want to have more money or more, which goes back to the Genevan thing, the Swiss thing, where there was a more settled, stable society where you had people who were wealthy, but they were helping other people.
He sort of has, in his genealogy of man, he sort of has 3 stages, which is where he differs from, say, Hobbes, who simply sets up the binary of non-social and social, or like the state and not in a state. And for Rousseau, there's kind of 3. There's kind of the state of nature, which is obviously what Hobbes refers to as red into claw and nasty brutish and short. But for Rousseau, Hobbes' state of nature is in what he kind of calls like the second stage, which is that man has begun to socialise, man has begun to compare himself to others' attributes, and he's obsessed with this period where everyone would be comparing each other's natural attributes, which is when everyone's sort of starting to realise that they can work together to help each other, because, as I said at the start, his view is that in a state of nature, you'd either be disinterested in anyone else, or if you saw them in pain, you'd kind of be like, oh, well, why are you suffering? Yeah. But it's when, after that stage, that you start to live alongside them, even in a forest or whatever his kind of iteration is, that someone says, oh, well, I can go out and forage, and you could stay and build our hut or whatever. And then when you learn who has expertise in certain fields, you then start to think, well, yeah, that's great, we're working alongside each other, but actually I wish that I was able to build a hut and make a nice hut rather than be the one out spearing animals or whatever. Or I wish I was able to have even just natural attributes like, oh, he's got really big muscles, or he's much better at doing this. And that's when he thinks that man falls into this kind of competitive sort of vain kind of mirror. But he sees that then intensifies massively with the industrial kind of the early kind of industrial period that the Enlightenment sparks, in terms of commerce, goods coming from the colonies, from overseas, and he sees that as massively intensifying. So yeah, certainly on that side. But before we go to any more of Jack and I's questions, did Peter or Alex yourself have anything in particular from this chapter that you thought there was a particular note for either of you that you'd like to raise?
I mean, it was similar to what you said. I think this whole idea of the true state of nature and so on. Because, having come across Hobbes' state of nature before, I wonder what the justification for positing this like pre-Hobbesian nature, state of nature, where before the relatively close stuff starts happening, people are also disinterested in each other, isolated. Sort of. I wonder where he gets that from, because that doesn't seem to be. I suppose the only kind of parallel I can think to it is the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
But there's even that is sort of within Christian thinking. There's never any real kind of conception of going back to the Garden of Eden. The idea is that the fault's happened. Now we've got to work out how to live in a society in a post-apocalyptic. Whereas with Rousseau, it's almost that it feels almost that
you can recreate
exactly the things that made the state of nature good are things that we should now be striving to implement into society again. And it just seems like a sort of fairly I've never really understood where he got that idea from.
I think there was also an interest in because of the exploration of what was the New World and Americas, the sort of interest of the indigenous population in North America, and whether they represented some way that middle, that sort of they were sort of exploring the kind of, they were at some extent like a noble savage, but they were also, they saw something, an emotional way that they would think about society. I think there was a sort of intellectual interest in that sort of that group of people, and to see that there may be this second state before this corrupting world.
Jack, you were going to?
I know there were, it might not be a fully satisfactory answer to your question, Alex, but I know there were biographical details which led him to think a certain way. I read an account of Rousseau which sort of ran in parallel to Augustine. And Sam, you'll have to help me. I don't know if Rousseau did actually write his own confessions.
In terms of Rousseau's confession. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. So he cites a number of instances in his life which made him come to this realization, what for him is a realization that he had a fundamentally good motive at the beginning, but because of the intervention of someone else or the intervention of society, it had all gone wrong. So he said he was asked to get, he was supposed to go to get some aubergine from the shop or something, from the market, and whatever, like he'd have to do that. He didn't have the funds, whatever. He stole the aubergine. And he reflected on it. He said, "Well, I had a fundamentally good motive to obey what had been asked of me, but because of someone got in the way, I don't remember the full thing. Someone got in the way. I didn't have enough funds. I had to resort to stealing. So that the imposition of foreign circumstances caused me to sin." He had a little reflection. He had an encounter with a prostitute, and for somehow for some reasoning in that moment, he finds something ugly about her, and then decide that society has made her that way. It's very interesting. There's also in that passage reflections on an essay competition where he wrote on where the essay question was to what extent had science contributed to the moral formation of.
Well, that is the essay that is the arts and sciences.
Great. So obviously I guess he's sceptical.
The discourse on the moral effects of arts and sciences.
Yes.
So it was sort of the moral effects of rationalism and.
Yeah, exactly. And also he gets quite obsessed about applause and trying to create art for the status quo, which he sees as in the Enlightenment, the thing that the Enlightenment is doing to harm itself, which is that everyone's applauding one another for these great inventions and these great masterpieces of kind of artistic or scientific endeavour, but actually they're sort of they're only looking, these artists and scientists, as far as Rousseau is concerned, is only looking to satisfy the contemporaries. They're not looking in a proper, what he sees as a proper Enlightenment vision, to be beyond the contemporaries, to actually be innovative. He thinks all we're doing is satisfying it, and this then comes back to this whole idea that, if you get glorified by a peer, you're going to feel much better about yourself, and therefore it comes back to this competition idea again, that actually what the 18th century is doing is just this sort of self-satisfaction, self-glorification.
I've got a quote here in this article. They said he saw England's political and economic might as a bogus liberty. The English people think it's free. It greatly deceives itself. It is free only during the election of members of Parliament. As soon as they're elected, the people are enslaved and count for nothing. So there's kind of it's this harking back, as you said, to some earlier state, or a state of more purity, which goes to the essence of mankind's way of really how they would be, unless before they were trapped by this commercial system.
So Rousseau was saying that.
Yeah,
read out.
According to this.
Because I think it's in the third chapter, he references Montesquieu.
Yeah, Montesquieu says about a murky democracy across the Channel.
Yeah, but I didn't understand why Rousseau was dissatisfied with Montesquieu. I thought Montesquieu made a very... So they both like the idea of what called... they made the distinction, vote for I read it in the French and I translated it back probably inappropriately. Vote by fate versus vote by choice.
Yeah.
So basically, what it means is you're voting for your MPs and then they get on with it, rather than rendering everything down to a vote on every matter all the time. That was the distinction. Montesquieu thought that the former was better, and so does Rousseau. Montesquieu justified it because he said it gave everyone an opportunity to participate in the service of the fatherland. Rousseau didn't like that, but he never said why. And then he made a practical argument which was perfectly valid, but I never understood. Anyway, but I thought that, so when you read that out, Peter, I thought that was what Rousseau was to say that you elect your MPs and then you enslave. But he advocates for that kind of a system in that passage, I think, unless he feels he's got sufficient alternative avenues for individuals to participate in the state that the English didn't have. For example, the censure. So I'll leave that open.
Peter?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know enough beyond that, really. It's kind of. But I think it's the context seems to be they're all kind of working through what a society should look like. And I think the historical context of when he was writing, it was again. I think France was so dominant as a, and then you've got the alternative, which was Britain, England, and I think he was kind of somehow arguing against both. Trying to say, and that's maybe the Swiss example.
I think he wouldn't like Britain partly for the reason of faction, which obviously comes back to the general will, but that he sees political parties in Britain, which quite a lot of commentators in Britain see them as simply factions. John Brown, the chap who I'm looking at for my PhD, who's compared to Rousseau in an English context, he sees the formation of party as simply the formation of vested interest. So when he's talking about electing MPs, yes, they are enslaved because ultimately you vote for a Whig or a Tory, or the Whigs and Tories both drop their political attributions and become kind of like the country party and that sort of thing. But ultimately, you're still only voting for a vested interest within that kind of corporate, commercialised sphere, and then nothing else.
So the lack of accountability.
A lack of accountability, but also probably just a lack of choice. like
So
these
there's
factions.
not that ability to
they don't
create new parties.
Yeah, for Rousseau or Brown, I wouldn't say that those parties represent as much. Even if they did represent differing ideas, they don't represent the extent of thought to which giving a voice to people like in Geneva allows you to work through ideas. You're removing your kind of you're sort of exporting your agency out, and therefore simply by the act of doing that you can't say that a society is truly free, because you've already sort of outsourced your agency to something else to make those decisions for you.
So what precisely is the solution for him in his state of Geneva to that state of affairs in England? Or is he, would it be reasonable to say he sort of got an inappropriate comparison? Because the factions emerge in England, it's England, whereas Geneva, very small. Is it just a matter that there's more local naturally there's more local representation in the state of Geneva than in England, or do they actually have something quite decisive here? And I don't quite remember.
I would say that he probably first of all would see Britain not only in terms of England, but in terms of the kind of mammoth sort of empire essentially by then that it's becoming, that he can't work out how England would ever be like Geneva. So that in terms of just like scale,
break it up and decentralise it.
I mean, if you address it, I don't think he's interested. I don't think he's interested enough in actually addressing the issues of England.
Okay.
Really, unfortunately, I don't think he would be necessary. I think, if we were to read outside of his text,
a huge problem, because there are nations. And there are big nations as well as small nations.
And I mean, if we do just take his point, he thinks, regardless of, ultimately he sees a virtuous small state as being good, and by his definition, a good state should thrive. And ultimately, if we do look historically, he was just wrong. Like, if we are going to look at this in terms of like practical how ideas played out, he was just wrong. Small states couldn't be kind of these little hubs of kind of beautiful democracy, and also his sort of like the idea of like being artisans, and maybe a small state could be unique and they can kind of sit alongside each other quite happily. His idea doesn't come to fruition. His idea of a general will doesn't come to fruition. Factionalism does rise. So I mean, I'm only saying this because I don't think he sees that at the time as what's going to happen. I think he is simply trying to address his contextual problem, which then turns out not to essentially work, and even obviously the cantons of Switzerland become a bigger state ultimately. So
I thought operating fairly autonomously. In some ways, I think if he's pointing to Geneva as a success, we look at the past 300 years of what life in Geneva has been like. It seems fairly successful compared to most places.
Oh no, I'm not saying Geneva wasn't, but in terms of the idea that this would be something taken up, and as sort of Jack was saying, like ultimately, if you read what he's trying to suggest, he is ultimately saying, well, should a large state just break up and become smaller states? That doesn't happen. No. Most empires expand and take over smaller states.
And also in the history of his own country, France was very fragmented for most of its history. And lots of centres of autonomy. Paris as a capital emerged very late. Very late. And so this fragmentation has been as much a cause for competition as the big state, which seems, in his view, and maybe reasonably stifle like authentic representation at the local level. So there's very complex factors going on.
Is there a difference between what Rousseau was arguing for never ended up working out, because nowadays you have much bigger states and the kinds of things he was claiming for, and lots of small states unified into empires, and you have good examples like Germany and Italy, and I suppose a contrary example might be somewhere like Austria-Hungary, but then you could make a geopolitical case why that broke up and so on. that's a fair point to say that actually things didn't. Rousseau was not on the side of history that ended up being right as to the way things would go. Does that mean he was wrong about the way things should have gone?
No, certainly not.
Yeah.
And that's why I think we still find him interesting to today, which is that his vision of society and the morality that society should be inculcating is certainly, I would say, an admirable one. I think, Jack, you would probably have some questions over that. But,
I've been really spending the time with him because it's not easy to argue with thinkers when they give you a whole book. But my sense is that he fundamentally goes wrong because I don't think there is a pure state of goodness in any form of society, because I think that the vices that are there from the beginning. I wouldn't go as pessimistic as the Calvinists, and I wouldn't go, and Hobbes and so forth. But if you just reflect on yourself and watch yourself through the day, you find all these vices, and it's not, what does it mean to put all that on society? Where does moral accountability go if all of our vices are attributable to this ephemeral entity, which is the abstract body politic?
Yeah.
It doesn't take much imagination to think of the kind of vices that can exist in the most primitive society, and I don't think all of them are reducible to commercial activities. I mean, even the things that you were describing earlier, Sam, with regards to you've got the different, he's doing house building, he's doing hunting, and then the envy introduces. Yeah. But it's not obvious that that's economic, in motivation at all. It's has a lot to do with vanity, with different attitudes about what constitutes a strong man, and maybe that you want to represent that for people. So the commercial factor, which he's quite big on, I believe, is I don't feel the force of that. Right. That comes a bit later for me. Envy, there's a good argument for that, but again, that's really there, really early on. And also, what about resentment?
Yeah.
The state of nature is all that. Though nature is a nice place to be. I mean, nature's vicious, horrifying. Goodness, it's only pleasant once you've got the economy to sustain you, so you can enjoy nature and its pleasantry. Then you can be an artisan. It wasn't so in the beginning. So that would be my critique. For that anthropological moral naivety, that's why you don't see it playing out in the history.
You can argue against it. You take a very kind of liberal view of, and you say that history's not with it. Of course, the counter to Rousseau is a kind of the liberal democracy and everything. Why wouldn't that work? And yet, if you look at the forces at play today with Trump and in Afghanistan and the things like where you've got and even in China, the idea that there is some kind of fundamental society that avoids the excesses of these kind of commercial ravages, and actually let's boil it down to what is around what the general will is. And so you could argue that he wasn't a liberal, but he does represent some form of view, which is a sort of from a liberal point of view, quite a ridiculous view, an impossible vision. But yet, some of the forces that are playing out in the world today are predicated on some kind of understanding of the will of the population, not through democracy, and it's not it's not a small state, but it's somehow some view of the world of the state which is better than the liberal democracy that we've been living with, and that's why I think he rankles a bit with me. I would say, a liberal democracy type person. He kind of think, well, it doesn't seem to fit. It's illogical. But actually, if you look at some of the other views around the world, he kind of makes he's got a lot of sense.
I suppose though, in the sort of contemporary political rhetoric, whenever you hear this kind of concept of the general will or the will of the people or whatever, it's usually used to bolster factionalism rather than to overcome it. It's usually used as a further argument in your list of why your particular side is better than another's by many different branches of politics, but very much used by directly opposing political forces. And I'm really not sure that Rousseau would have any idea of that. I think it's almost just a kind of parroting of that. I don't think it really has very much substance to it. And I think Rousseau would probably say, actually, people just using the term, I mean, it's like the words common good. You see that all the time, starting talking about the common good. But what does that mean? What does that look like? And if it's self-evident, then why does everyone disagree about it?
Yeah.
You can say either Rousseau got it wrong and it's very much not self-evident, and so even introducing the term is problematic, because as soon as you start talking about the general will, everybody's going to have an argument about it. Or Rousseau's right, but people just aren't looking at the general will in the right way. Yeah. And in both scenarios, he's basically failed.
Yeah. I'll just add to that. There's a passage where he says that here's how the common good will play out, the general will play out. We'll all have a vote in my opinion system. And if I get outvoted, I just didn't have the general will. I didn't know it. And for me, that move makes the general will lose its transcendence, because then it's not obvious to me what the general will is as anything distinct from what do you say? The historical process.
Yeah.
With finite men, on the basis of the knowledge they have, voting. There's nothing about the common good that seems to go beyond that, because you might think that the common good is some insight into the longevity, but the problem is it's just in that way Rousseau describes it. Next year you'll have a vote, and maybe the consensus will uphold what was previously permissible on the general will. There's no obvious reason why that wouldn't be the case. He makes it an axiom that the common will, the general will, is pure, unalterable, and unchanging. But in practice, that's not what any democracy really looks like. We'll go back and forth on an issue.
Yeah.
And so, what does that mean? Sort of for that reason, it's just saying, the common good is just voting. I think he completely undermines the deification of the common good that he is quite openly striving for. I mean, it's clearly what do you say, a saving grace axiom at the bottom of the system, but it just, you can't fit it into the real world.
Yeah. And I think that sort of perennial, unaltering element does also come across when he talks about that perfect society of true Christians, which he says aren't Christians of today. Yeah. He says are these kind of Christians of the gospel, that would be the perfect society, those who would be this sort of holy, sublime, true religion of men, in being the children of the same God, all acknowledge one as brothers. He's sort of really defining this as kind of, you need a civic religion to bind those elements. So I think in terms of the voting part, but I think what I'm trying to say on top of your point is that that you do need to have a kind of there is a sort of taught moral element to I think what he's suggesting. It's not just the voting. There is something else embedded in what he sees as fundamental to creating a successful state, which is a bit like, as he's saying, a bit like these children of the gospel, kind of like that.
That's fair.
Yeah.
But if maybe that's a good place to turn, because he looked quite extensively on religion. He put 3 alternative versions of religion forward. A religion of pure interiority, which is like that gospel, isn't at all what the gospel says, in my opinion. But there goes Rousseau. The external, where you frame every political decision as a religious interdict. So you impose the religious language on top of politics, and they become one. That's the extrinsic. And then the third kind was with what he felt Christianity had become in history, where there had been the separation of the two kingdoms, the kingdom of earth and the kingdom of heaven, and then an attempt to square them.
Yeah. But one couldn't make out the magistrate and the prince.
He said that it divided people internally. Now, but then he proceeds to find fault with all three of those. And even the first one, which is obviously most amenable to what he likes. He obviously very much enjoys this version of the gospel he paints, and it feeds into his version of the state of nation. It becomes what Shelley would call the sort of the interdiction of the poets to be the sort of legislators of the world, the moral legislators of the world. But he warns, not even warns, just concedes that
because of its purity.
Because of its purity, it's not obvious what the relation it has to the state is, because it seems to draw its purpose is to draw people's hearts away from the state as they would draw people's hearts from any other object. He says. So I don't know what his religious view is, like in terms of like its relevance to this discerning the common good. He doesn't leave us with a solution in the end. I don't know if he has it anywhere else. Like maybe proposes a fix to this in other writings, but this is a big problem for him.
I think he sees religion, I don't know about you chaps, but sees religion very much just as the binding force of a common bond between, so that you have that internal sense because it sort of is formative in creating a citizen, and therefore everyone has a kind of, because he's not talking about any specific religion obviously in terms of what he sees as being useful. He sort of obviously is associating with Christianity, and there are a lot of scholars who very much say Rousseau was just in a line of kind of like counter-enlightenment, romantic-y kind of sort of scholars looking back to Christianity and trying to pick out what could work moving forward. But I would say that it's very much just the binding force between men within the society to give that grounding to then build up from as a state. I don't know, Peter or Alex, there.
Yeah, I mean, that whole time was this sort of how was religion related to the state, and it was just sort of everybody seemed to be coming up with various different theories of kind of alternate religion. I mean, like Thomas Carlyle was similarly sort of working out what was the relationship, but somehow I think the risk is, and my limited interpretation is, the risk is we're kind of looking at his conversation in light of what we think of now as the state and what we think as religion. He was it's distilled into something kind of purer, which is the moral authority of that community, and it works in a small organisation. Somehow we kind of believe there's a sort of basic moral truth that pervades, and I think he was kind of wanting to get back to that, not to I didn't get the impression he was trying to have a different alternative religion. It was more the kind of moral idea that was important.
I was slightly confused by his whole approach to religion, partly for similar reasons as Jack mentioned, and also you mentioned, Peter, that I think he's not really engaging with the kinds of discussions that we're expecting him to engage with about what religion is or how it operates or anything like that. He's just talking about religion as almost from a sociological point of view. Which I think is quite counterintuitive. I think nobody embraces a religious viewpoint or engages in religious practices or participates in a religious community because of the perceived good for society, or okay, some people might do, but it's very much a minority position, I think. And even so, I think those kinds of people, I know people, for example, who might go to church on Sundays because they think it's good for society, but they don't actually believe in any sort of metaphysical truth to the religion they practice. But even so, they probably wouldn't describe themselves as being of that religion or part of that religious community. They just kind of, they do it as a sort of exterior action, but so as not to be hypocritical, they don't say, well, I'm a Christian. Well, no, I'm not a Christian, but I think it's a good thing to go to church.
Yeah.
So I think, it's and the fact that not only is he analysing it from a sociological point of view, but then sort of fails to really reach any conclusions. He sort of just looks at various instantiations of religion and ends up kind of stumped. Like, what was the point of that? Well, I don't really know. To a certain extent, there's a certain amount of intellectual humility there that I appreciate.
Yeah.
And his sort of remarks about how if we do have one, it should have not too much dogma.
Yeah.
It should have not too much dogma, not too much so that people don't need to spend too much time learning it. Just something nice and simple that everyone can kind of understand.
Very consistent on him.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, sort of maybe bringing it back to the question of liberty, which is the theme of this series. What does, a question which is related to that, and then we can maybe consider the other implications of liberty in the text, but what does his views on religion actually mean for liberty and for, because he framed that chapter the question of religious tolerance, and because it was inconclusive, I just took that he was religiously intolerant, but that might be too uncharitable of me. I know you're writing a PhD on this subject, on religious toleration. You've talked to me a bit about some of those pervasive contradictions in that I can think of on this very subject. I don't know if you have any thoughts on where Rousseau stands on this.
I think you could probably take it two ways in the sense that, well, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, this is obviously coming out of a massive debate in what is sort of termed politico-theology, where you had Cardinal Bellamy in the previous century discussing the state and religion and essentially actually the hammer of heretics. Cardinal Bellamy essentially in his tract kind of separates the state and the spiritual and puts them to, and creates that division. So for Rousseau, I suppose, for the civic religion, it's sort of both intolerant and tolerant in the sense that I don't think he'd exclude anyone on the basis of, in a sense, but I suppose he wouldn't exclude anyone on the basis of sort of religious background in the sense that it almost wouldn't matter because as soon as you came into the state, you would sort of be encompassed into a bit like what Alex said, something that's kind of a sociological religion. I mean, I suppose if you were kind of putting his ideas in action, the reality would be that you'd kind of have the religion sort of beaten out of you in sort of in a kind of secularizing way if you were to try and implement it. But I don't think it would be exclusive in the sense of I think his system is quite tolerant in the way that he's looking at it, which is that you can't simply on the basis that he does see merits in various faiths. I mean, he does see merits in Muhammad and the Mohammedans. He does see merits. I don't think it's exclusive and thereby intolerant. However, I just don't think different sects and different faiths would ultimately be functioning because that would obviously be religious faction. And because he wants to see religion, unlike what Bellamy did, which was separate these spiritual temporal realms, as we've just discussed, he wants to reintegrate the spiritual, in a sense, back into the state. You would therefore have to kind of wordily beat out the religion from someone by telling them that you're now part of the state. You don't need that faith, you've got the civic religion sort of thing. But that would be universal, so it'd be fair. Everyone would have it.
I think at the time, I think one's got to recognise that the Catholic Church was, I think, my understanding, he was, unlike Voltaire, he was very critical of the Catholic Church, and therefore religion. I thought Rousseau sort of was critical of the Catholic Church, but was kind of looking at the underlying morality of religion and trying to say that was still an important factor.
Exactly.
And I think the whole role of the Catholic Church in Europe was such a sort of dominant theme, which may come back to the Swiss example, where the Catholics were not part of that, and that sort of pervading sort of pollution of religion by the Catholic Church was something that was kind of part of the force of the revolution itself, in fact, wasn't it?
certainly, and I do think that Catholics would probably, that was something I didn't say, but his hatred of the Catholics as a political force, in terms of things like the Catholic League, which he writes about, would be something that would probably exclude them on a practical basis. But in relation to your point, Peter, yeah, no, I completely agree in terms of the morality side. I think what I was saying was that they'd have to, if they were integrated into Rousseau's ideal state, whether you were a Mohammedan, a Protestant, a Catholic, a Jew, you would have to probably forgo your faith if you were integrated into Rousseau's ideal state, because I suppose he's saying that there's merits in all of them, and at some base level you can access that morality from any of those walks, I think, essentially. But you would be told probably you need to let go of your particular faith because of faction, because he's so afraid that it could cause faction.
I wondered if I could.
We could probably conclude.
Yeah,
if we've got
maybe to the
remarks.
concluding question.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring back to the beginning, where he says that the social contract is the most voluntary act you can make, and for that reason it ought to be the foundation of society. I want to put the question whether that is a good foundation for liberty, whether that makes liberty unreliable, because there's something about that voluntarism to participate, which also is a voluntarism to pull back. And I guess the conservative idea used to be that if you rather made your foundation for society some kind of duty or obligation, there was something about that bind there which then really did enable liberty, because now you really had to sit there and work it out together.
Yeah.
The game was well defined and would be consistent, and people wouldn't just abandon, right?
Yeah.
The project when it ceased to be going their way. Is there something the liability to undermine the liberties of people if all that's at the bottom of this is voluntarism?
You guys go first.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that it allows for the possibility of opting out of the social contract while at the same time living in its shadow, so to speak, which I think is particularly, I mean, you find this with, I suppose you find this to some extent with the American Revolution, or with any of the revolutions really. But I remember at the time of the coronation last year, or 2 years ago now, when, there was a thing where I think the Archbishop of Canterbury put out on social media, at the same time as I'm making the oath of allegiance to the King, I'd like to invite all patriots to make this oath to the King as well. And lots of people sort of put out on their social media saying, well, I, as a point of principle, I'm not going to be making this oath because he's not my king, whatever. And I remember the Archbishop being criticised for this a lot. The now former, or I don't know if has he gone yet? I don't know, who knows. But
Semi-state.
Yeah.
Leaving.
One foot out the door.
State of apology.
Yeah. But I remember
an apology there.
Yeah.
But I remember there being a lot of criticism at the time. The idea being that a bit like people can go around saying, not my president because I didn't vote for him, when in fact once someone has been properly voted in as president of a country, he is now your president if you're a citizen of that country. Similarly, to say, well, I didn't make an oath of allegiance to the king, therefore he's not my king, when you hold a British passport, and as such you sort of have a certain obligation of allegiance to the king as a kind of figurehead of your nation. And that was an interesting kind of point, and I think that's what Rousseau's idea falls prey to, this idea that, well, I'm currently a British citizen and availing myself of the social contract. At some point, I might choose not to do so. What does that look like? Does that mean I have to flee the country, renounce my citizenship, and avail myself of another social contract? Can I just kind of live in an asocial way by finding some desert island somewhere?
Well, finding the local savage and the tribe.
Exactly, yeah.
With them.
And what does that mean for other people, and to what extent they can depend upon you?
Right.
In every society, if there isn't that guarantee of being able to depend on people.
Yeah.
So, another naive optimism, perhaps.
Peter.
I not really much other than I think the recognition that he wasn't talking about society as in the whole depth of society. You know, it wasn't like the American everybody had a vote. It was a very elitist group he was kind of talking about.
Yeah.
And a bit like your Roman example, it wasn't, you know, not everybody who lives in Rome, it was only the people who were non-slaves.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, because it sort of segues nicely into the next session, which is that there's a lot of reliance on tacit consent, that idea that you are participating, but and thereby you're not having to declare that you're consenting to be part of it. But by the very nature of you participating within the society, you're therefore consented to tacit or which is what Locke talks about, and where a lot of these ideas, we haven't sort of done it chronologically because we wanted to put Locke and Paine together in the next session on the 19th of December, so we do hope we'll see you both again. This was our first session, we were test running it, and we were very pleased to have a couple of people.
I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's
fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Superb. And the next one will be on the 19th, and we'll look at Locke and Paine, and we'll be looking at exactly that tacit consent in terms of Locke and in Paine as well. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much.
And I guess, are we going to the Liberal Club or are you going?
Might go for a drink
Yeah.
somewhere. Yeah.